welcome, and for those of you who joined the prior sessions, welcome back. I'm really excited to discuss another important topic here, which is about how ESG performance can help secure finance. This is a major topic when we talk about going from reporting and going from simple measuring to action and to implementation. And so considering the financial implications of what the sustainability data, what the sustainability information can tell us is really going to be central. And so we're really fortunate here to be joined by a number of experts across a variety of industries who are going to be able to give a set of unique perspectives on this. I'll ask them as I introduce them and then speak about these different points for them to just maybe say a little bit more about themselves. But as a starting point, we have Hampus Friberg from H&M. We have Lewis Perkins from the Apparel Impact Institute, Charles Assaf from Novisto, Jenny Sim from Oliver Wyman, Jenny McCullough from McDonald's, and as mentioned, myself with the UN Environment Program's Finance Initiative. So just to jump into it, I think for Hampus, Lewis, and Jenny McCullough, one of the questions that I think is certainly central is how is your organization tracking and thinking about sustainability impact? We've talked in some of these prior panels about metrics, about measure, but what really gets to the heart of impact and how does that connect into financing? How does that connect into strategic choices? And give each of you a little bit of an opportunity to talk maybe about what your firm is doing on those topics. Maybe if Jenny wants to start, just.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So when we think about McDonald's, we're a global restaurant company. We're operating in over 100 markets, and we have nearly 40,000 restaurants globally. So that depends on a real estate footprint, it depends on a food and agriculture and packaging footprint, and it depends on a lot of engaging with people, whether that's suppliers, franchisees, and employees that work across all of those operations and help us grow the food that we serve our millions and millions of customers. So when we think about impact, we try to prioritize strategies, goals, as well as measurement in areas related to taking care of the planet, taking care of food quality and how we source, and the producers behind our sourcing, looking at creating jobs, inclusion, and empowering people that work in the restaurants and across the supply chain, and then how we show up and support communities. So those areas tend to be our impact focus areas. Within each one, we have metrics that we track related to impact. So a good example would be when we think about, we're a food and burger company, a lot of opportunity to track the impact of food production in those supply chains. So we work with suppliers of commodities like our beef, the soy that goes into our chicken, the coffee that we serve, palm oil ingredients, the packaging and our, the fiber-based packaging, and say, how do we prevent deforestation in how we source all of those? So that would be a good example of an impact metric that cuts across commodities, it cuts across geographies. It's very top of mind for investors, and we get into those conversations about how are we driving impact from both an impact area lens, protecting nature, biodiversity, preventing deforestation, as well as from a geography and commodity lens. There's a lot of other examples, but that's just one.
Great. Maybe Hampus?
Yeah, sure. From the apparel industry, so obviously a very different type of industry and different set of challenges. Not as many of our own stores in the same, so scope 1 and scope 2 and sort of our own operations is obviously not as big or as complex. However, scope 3 and the supply chain we're working with, the apparel supply chain, is very complex and have had some, unfortunately, some bad incidents over the last couple of years as well. So looking at it from an impact perspective, we started out looking a lot for the social impact and the sort of the human rights and securing that all throughout the supply chain. Even though we have come far, obviously there's still a long way to go there. But starting from there, we're now spanning over not just for people, but also over to planet. So looking at a couple of different impact areas, trying to align them, of course, with what is big, what is material for our business. And that for us will be a lot in terms of water, which is a big source of a big input into the production, both in terms of the sourcing of the material, but then also, of course, in the dyeing and the processes that we're using to creating our garments. So really trying to look at, okay, what are some big areas that we have a big impact on, and then trying to drill down from there and seeing, okay, what is it that we should be measuring, looking at science, looking at what is going on, and obviously there's a ton of development from all of the place on a lot of these areas, but trying to figure out where can we have the biggest impact and really set key results and KPIs to try to track that. So water, greenhouse gas emissions are the two of the big areas, but then also, okay, how do we measure human rights? How can we make sure that everybody working in a position that they have an impact on that? How can they see those metrics? How can they follow them as well? And also looking into now forests as well, land use, and chemicals, and basically a big, broad area of impact, but trying to follow the same playbook of identify where can we have an impact, how can we measure that, and then how can we make sure that everybody that takes a decision that involves that have that information in place to make a better decision.
Yeah, that's great. And Lewis, I'm interested to hear your perspectives and experience on that measuring impact and thinking about what matters and how it ties back into strategies.
Absolutely. Well, maybe I'll take a second just to kind of explain who we are, and then in the process of that, answer the question. So, following up on Hampus, actually both of the previous two, we were Apparel Impact Institute was established by the industry along with government funding and private philanthropy to basically identify solutions that were ready for scale for decarbonizing the fashion supply chain, but also looking at other nature-based and KPIs related to water, land use, biodiversity, and certainly chemical management as well. So what we do is we actually work with the suppliers across their shared supply chain with a regional approach, and then we help deploy programming working with third-party service providers in those countries, and basically acting as a convener both to the supply chain but also to the brand retailers. And so to answer your question, a large part of how we were established was actually to have measurable data coming off the back end of all the projects that we would run, and ultimately looking at decarbonizing the supply chain across all the tiers. So in the apparel sector, you going from farm to facility to facility to facility, and each one of those has its own unique carbon footprint related to the type of energy it's using, thermal heat, material choices, et cetera. And it's also different by country, obviously. And so our ability to be able to go in and not only deploy solutions and programming, bring the sustainable finance through partnerships with banks and private equity, but also being able to look at the actual verified data of CO2 emission on the back end. And so that's the role that we're playing. And we launched a Fashion Climate Fund this last year, a $250 million fund, which H&M Group is one of the lead partners. And with that, then attracting another $2 billion in debt and equity to go alongside it. So it's increasingly important as we're building out that framework of deploying capital that we're ensuring that we're not only reporting back to a brand across their science-based targets commitments, but the supplier themselves, and then, of course, to the investors that are putting capital into that. So that's the role that we play.
I think it's really helpful getting those perspectives from those across different industries and tying this into finance. One of the questions I have for Jenny Sim is talking about this landscape. You obviously work closely with a number of financial institutions and think about some of these questions of sustainability, of impact, of metrics. How are financial actors as well as supervisors thinking about both corporate commitments as well as corporate reporting on these questions of impact, and how is it filtering up into the decisions and practices we're seeing amongst finance?
Yeah, thanks, David. That's a really interesting question. I guess just very quickly, given that we're less of a high street name, very quickly in terms of Oliver Wyman, we are a global management consulting firm. We work across sectors, and particularly we also have a global climate and sustainability practice that we kind of have that capability to advise our clients on climate sustainability. So yes, so in terms of the financial services sector, I think what's really interesting is how quickly things have moved over the past few years. If I to take one example on climate, for example, we have one reference point being the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. That has now become an alliance of financial institutions, over 500 of them, that represent a really big collection of the world's kind of capital and financing and investment. And they have their members now, which are global banks, asset managers, asset owners, insurance companies, have all pledged to commit to net zero, and as part of that set their own targets for net zero. And in terms of that, it's actually quite powerful, because if I think about financial services companies, when we think about what their emissions are, essentially all they are their portfolio emissions, which is a reflection of who they lend to, who they invest in, who they insure. And in order for them to now meet those very public commitments that they have made, they are going to have to then take into account this into their decision making. And so we've seen the shift in terms of banks, investors, and I'm sure we'll get into this a bit later, in terms of taking more of an interest on ESG performance in their kind of investment and lending decisions. We've recently done some research into this, and if we look at the outstanding corporate debt, for example, at the moment in even Europe, most of this is still to companies that don't have necessarily credible transition plans, defined as, we can go in a little bit more like, what do we mean by credible? But so if we think about that, then an enormous shift actually needs to happen. And so those financial institutions need to make that shift, and they're starting to embed consideration of ESG quite deliberately into their decision making, whether it's looking at certain metrics, asking for data, assessing transition plans of companies such as those of my panelists. And I think also what we're seeing is the regulatory landscape is changing as well. So both for the real economy, we're seeing the European regulations come in the US, in the UK, and more broadly, but particularly for financial sector as well, their regulators, their supervisors are taking a very keen interest in their practices here, and we're seeing the downstream trickle of all of that. So I think we're going to see a lot more action in this space over time, and I'm sure we can explore that further.
Yeah. Just build on that quickly. I wanted to give the perspective from the other side of the table as well, where when we speak with our largest shareholders and investors, we have seen that same shift, like you mentioned, the last few years, where 5 years ago, as Chief Sustainability Officer, I wasn't on calls regularly with large institutional investors. Now we're having stewardship calls a couple times a year with most of our largest shareholders. And instead of asking, do you have a net zero ambition? Do you have science-based targets? Yes. We were the first restaurant company to do that. They're saying, okay, how are you engaging your scope 3 stakeholders? As a franchisor with an independent supply chain, 99% of our footprint is scope 3. So it's really seeing a much more sophisticated conversation and asking, because of those commitments across their portfolios, asking the questions in a more nuanced and strategic way as the data evolution, as well as just the expectations of this sector of investors keep rising. So it's really exciting to feel the momentum.
Yeah, I think that feeling of momentum and an interest both from financial stakeholders as well as those in the supervisory spaces is definitely growing and will only continue to pick up with the release of the ISSB, the International Sustainability Board's standards in June for sustainability as well as more specifically climate. Maybe going to Charles now to speak a little bit about seeing some of the tools and products in the financial space that corporates and others are using to potentially link sustainability and access to finance. And if you could talk a little bit about the principles that underlie those. And then, of course, very interested to hear from the rest of the panel about their experience, both with green products as well as on some of those definitions, as Charles will go into.
Thank you, David. First things first, obviously, all companies are leveraging their sustainability performance to access financing through different channels. As Jenny just mentioned, investors, on the equity market side, investors are seeking this type of information. They're seeking specific ESG targets. But also, I guess, the more mainstream way is through debt instruments, so green bonds, green loans, sustainability-linked loans. And for that to happen, obviously there is an indispensable need for corporates not just to measure but also disclose essentially on a set of performance metrics, a set of ESG metrics. So the reliability, the quality, the access, the tooling that is needed to capture this information becomes critical effectively to move into these and access these opportunities of financing. So for us, obviously, we look at it as to data is a major challenge. Louis just mentioned how complex it is when you look at it in the value chain of a company, considering the various suppliers and in most commonly in your value chain, most of the players in that value chains are not as mature when it comes to sustainability management, or at least when it comes to thinking about data and disseminating this information, downstream. So it is a big challenge, and for us, it starts with the right data sets, with the quality, the reliability, and the right tooling to capture this information.
Yeah.
And I build on that quickly. I mean, we did in 2021 launch our sustainable linked bond, which was very popular, I think 7 times oversubscribed. So very interesting, a lot of interest from different types of players on that. However, as you said, I mean, we now publish our bond progress reports to look at, okay, how we're following up on those metrics. And I mean, the financial market is also used to data being, I mean, maybe more rigorous and standardized. And what we're seeing now is that we are still chasing data sets and are improving our data and our accuracy of our data over time. Also very challenging on how to balance those. So how can you go out and make commitments, even though you know that we are making those commitments on data we have right now, but we're working on improving the data whilst we're still running the process. So I think it's very interesting on how to balance these 2 different worlds. And I think for ESG performance and financing, that's really when it meets.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add to that, I mean, if you look at the green bond principles, there are, if you adhere to these guidelines, part of these guidelines is getting external assurance, essentially having an external company validate the information. So obviously this strengthens the position of a company in terms of building that credibility with the investors and effectively better accessing, green bonds and green financing in general.
If I can come in there.
Please, no.
I think another point I would also make is that the world is imperfect and is incredibly messy. And if I think about, green bonds and green bond principles, like it works very well if you can very specifically classify an activity and you have the perfect data to do it. But actually, as we know, most of the world is not there. Most of the financing actually needs to go into much messier activities and transition activities and so forth, where the data is arguably even worse. And so I think there's an element of this which is recognizing that that is a challenge, recognizing the data is imperfect, but actually also transparency and getting something out there is also our friend in this to try and do that. I think if I think about the financial sector, I think there is a lot of ultimately, if I think about banks, for example, they come from a place of already having a portfolio, already having clients and needing to be on that journey with their clients and with their customers. And, and it's not possible for everyone to have perfect data. I think it's very much kind of going on that journey together.
Yeah, I think that data topic is such a critical one here in the sense that we're looking for data maybe that hasn't previously been collected. We're looking for places across supply chains where there is opacity or lack of clarity in the information. And I would open it up again to the full panel on these questions of data in the sense both what are some of the biggest challenges you see, what are some of those specific areas, and then how can some of those challenges be potentially overcome, or what are some of the things to do to bridge those gaps to make it a more functional and clearer view of where impact is taking place, and then how that can, of course, be turned to financial access. Anyone? I see Charles.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to start.
You're in my line of sight, so I guess that's the.
Great line.
We're gonna pick on him.
Okay. Well, first things first on impact. Measuring impact. Just to define what measuring impact is, it's really measuring changes in outcomes, at the level of the environment, at the level of society. So that is very complex when we think about what is actually needed as an input to be able to assess that. So when we think about measurement of impact beyond having access to the company's data, and we just talked about the supply chain and the complexity of getting access to granular information from the supply chain, Scope 3 is a great example on this one. I think there is an external set of data that is more at a macro level that is needed to have an accurate assessment of impact measurement. So to illustrate my point here, if you can be reducing emissions, but calculating your contribution to limiting the rise of temperature, let's say to the 1.5 degree, is a challenge on its own. So the macro level data access to this information is indispensable to be able to accurately get to that holistic measurement of impact. So I think it's a double challenge internally and externally in terms of data sets.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I mean, we rolled out of a work stream happening at the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which is an organization that was founded to help align data sets and tools for the supply chain to measure its social and environmental performance, really to benchmark, going back 10, 15 years ago, like where are we today versus where can we go next? And so our work streams rolled out of the need to take those data insights and actually start implementing improvements so that we could then start to look at year-over-year engagement. And when we inherited a lot of the programs that were running out of the supply chain, it was Excel spreadsheets that were being distributed across different platforms that we were collecting and measuring that. And we found the opportunity really existed for us to build out our own tools around that, which I think sometimes you say, you're building out your own tools. Everybody is kind of building out their own tools around measurement. And so it's also going to be increasingly important that these tools are speaking to each other and these data sets are aligned in a way that we can verify them with a central verification scheme or a framework for carbon accounting. And so that's a big part of what we're looking at now too, because it's one thing when we're running 25 efficiency programs in China or 15 in Bangladesh, but as we're starting to really take on a lot more programs and projects, it's going to be critical on our part, but then how these suppliers themselves are ensuring that verified data is actually getting back to the supplier who has subsidized, or the brand retailer who's subsidized or incentivized them to take on this initiative to begin with, and is helping in some cases to help secure loans or other ways to make those improvements. And so that's a big piece that we're trying to solve for as well now too, as we build out a better framework for credible data.
I look at it from a few dimensions. On one hand, I think the frameworks and the standards keep changing and they're trying to harmonize, but they still have a ways to go. So that is one challenge inherently for most corporates trying to report out and disclose efficiently, is just it's a moving target of what's being asked for and how we do that. It's moving in the right direction of harmonization, which is good. But as I said, we still have a ways to go there. Another piece would be the decentralized nature of many business models, especially when you start to really unpack Scope 3 emissions. And, for us, there are ways we can estimate and extrapolate, for example, franchisee energy loads based on our company-owned restaurants. They're often very comparable. In some markets, we have access to anonymized franchisee energy data and energy management systems at a restaurant level. In some markets, we don't. And so we have to kind of estimate and extrapolate according to third-party guidance for how to do that credibly. When it comes to agriculture and supply chain, I think we also have to think through sort of the level of trust around all these questions around transparency back to the producer and farm level. When we think about how we work with rural communities that are producing the food that everybody eats every day, whether it's at McDonald's or otherwise, farmers and ranchers maybe aren't as excited to share information about what's going on their farm. They need to see value in it for them. Oftentimes that's about learning and sharing insights farmer to farmer to make sure that they're understanding best practices and sort of how they benchmark. But oftentimes it's, access to these markets and ecosystem service, carbon market valuation. Again, the frameworks have what will be counted and what will be credible keep changing, so it's a little bit hard to make a bet when you only have so many growing seasons before 2030. And so that bringing the producer and bringing the kind of hyper-local stakeholders along is just as important as it is for the big corporates to be able to kind of roll it up into aggregated views that at an investor level or portfolio level would be relevant. So we do have to think about it on a number of dimensions. And certainly when we think about access to capital, it's important at the corporate level. It's also really important at the producer level, and what it takes to transition into kind of climate smart production for a small farmer is a very different conversation than a portfolio-wide conversation about a sustainability bond or what have you. So it's important to be looking at it from a lot of those lenses.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of that as well, and then coming back to the apparel industry, I mean, we also started out very much collecting data in terms of people and in terms of human rights violation and making sure all of that was good. So we created our own platform, basically, that we rolled out to all of our suppliers in order to capture that data. And then sort of over time, sort of just building more into that. And using standardized data points, but basically having a huge system that we're then trying to push through to all of our suppliers and deeper into the supply chain. And we quite quickly run into the problem that even though for our tier one suppliers, I mean, they might have the incentive to fill that in and to follow up. For their suppliers, or tier two, the incentive starts to decrease already. And then we get further down, it gets more difficult to get someone to come on board. And when the supply chain also split into so many different types of industries, you realize that, okay, we're trying to push our global solution out to everyone, and it's going to be a case of, I mean, our product doesn't fit anybody. So now we're really trying to sort of switch that around and using one set of data capture for data we need, but then also try to look at, okay, what is some either local solutions or industry-based best practices, and how can we tap into those? So we're not trying to sort of push what we want all the way out, but rather, okay, is there already some development happening that we can leverage, and rather having everything come up and being, I mean, in the cloud, or at least talking to each other, which of course requires standardization, but it's in the long run, I think, the sustainable way, because it will not be possible for all companies to push their solutions down, because at the end of the day, you got a supplier that needs to fill in, you know, slightly different data points in 30 different systems, and I mean, that's not going to work for anybody.
Yeah, I think that point of the complexity is something I definitely want to revisit, not just in the context of data, but also in terms of engagement. And interested to hear from all of you, both on the corporate perspective, across the financial industry and in the data space. What does that engagement look like when it comes to your supply chain? I feel like Scope 3 has been so discussed, and that is important to note, really just the tip of the iceberg when we begin to consider other ESG-related matters. And many of these companies up here have engaged with suppliers for much longer, well before there were TCFD standards, before there were sustainability reporting. And so one of the questions is, how do you pull these pieces together in engaging with these numerous suppliers, as well as this question again of finance? How does your relationship with them act as a potential lever, both to create that positive and virtuous cycle of greater sustainability progress on the point of suppliers, followed by access to finance, followed by improved performance? That's what we see, and it's easy in the one-for-one of I'll give you, a sustainability-linked bond. It isn't so easy when you're looking at touching thousands of franchises, when you're looking at touching thousands of suppliers, or for a portfolio, looking across, hundreds, if not thousands of positions. So really eager to open that up, now kind of going from the recipients of this to the engagers. What perspectives and guidance would you share with the audience?
We talk a lot about just getting started somewhere, right? So when we think about our climate journey as a McDonald's system and with our suppliers and franchisee partners, one of the first steps that we've taken has been, because like you mentioned, we've been working with suppliers on sustainability agendas for longer than I've been at McDonald's, for many decades now. But a lot of the climate and metrics tracking in this space is really evolving more recently. So we started with a lot of different commodity-specific sustainable sourcing goals as we came into 2020, we're now then layering in impact area goals around emissions reduction or forest protection, things like that. But setting a basic expectation that proactive global suppliers should set science-based targets if they don't have them. In our case, many of our suppliers already have science-based targets. Many are just getting going on this journey. So just that sort of encouragement and expectation that as a large customer for them, we care about their own climate strategies and targets, and then leveraging tools like CDP supply chain, which helps make it a bit more of a streamlined process where a lot of end retail customers can sign on to CDP's disclosure benchmarking platform, and suppliers that supply to a number of different end retailers can sort of divvy up which aspects of their footprint go to the different brands. And so we have a lot of our global suppliers reporting into CDP supply chain across the kind of highest impact emissions categories and commodities that we source. And so we're getting there. We're sort of transitioning to setting strategies, setting targets with suppliers, hearing what they're learning on their journeys, getting more disclosure and transparency as part of that process. And then I think what we're still working on, and we will be for some time, is really how do you bring that sort of land-based sector, agriculture-based sector metrics and information into a more consistent set of principles. And Science-Based Target Initiative has just very recently set guidance for our sector. There are many sectors that they're still sort of working out the guidance for. So I think just expecting that it will take time, knowing it's a dynamic landscape, getting started, and then continuing to refine and emphasize for the retailers in the room, emphasize how important this work is from a customer perspective.
Yeah.
I was just going to add to that because you've made me think one of the things is in our industry, there's a lot of target setting and encouragement of that's happening at the supply chain level, but we're also trying to encourage don't wait to set the targets to get started on the improvements because we kind of don't have time to do it in stages in that way. And it's complex because we're trying to create the demand and help de-risk, the solutions that we do want to get to scale and bring the capital in. And so it's this sort of cat and mouse or, chicken and egg sort of game of like target setting, but at the same time, go ahead and start in with efficiency work or join in with electrification of boilers or whatever types of initiatives that we may be recommending to get them started on lowering their carbon between now and 2030. This industry has established a target of 50% reduction, which is in alignment with a lot of industries, but they're certainly behind in terms of the momentum that needs to be taken on. And so working with the suppliers to help incentivize them also to understand that this is better for their business long term, this is resiliency within their countries, et cetera. And so that's a large part of what we're trying to establish too through the work that we're doing, not only our organization, but as an ecosystem with the UN and others that are really participating in this conversation of textile apparel suppliers.
Yeah. I think, touching a little bit on both of these points, I think also purchasing practices, as you said, having clear requirements on setting targets or having an ambition level in there. I think purchasing practices is a term I hear speak about more and more. So that feels like an area a lot of people are starting to identify. But I think also coming back to that, what we've been doing for a long time is working with our strategic suppliers. And having, even though there's a lot of them, have quite long-term relationships with them, and have, of course, over the years tried to align and work more with suppliers that are sharing the same set of beliefs that this is important for us. But coming back to then the financing, in the apparel industry, a lot of the financing needed would be to change technology. So it is really about changing out the coal boiler to something else in a factory. And here we've launched a couple of years ago a division called the Green Investment at H&M, which work actively to then supply either direct or indirect financing to our suppliers. That's also why we're working a lot with John here of the AII, of trying to find out, what are good cases and providing here are possible solutions, and then we're coming in with the financing for that as well. But I think an important question or an important realization we've come to in that work as well is that what we think of as the financing needed might not be the same for all suppliers as well. Yeah. So it might be very different as well. In terms of, are we talking about direct or indirect investments, or are we talking about maybe doing commitments on quantity? Are we doing commitments on some other areas? So I think it's also really about working one-to-one with suppliers, and then specifically the key suppliers, the biggest suppliers, of understanding what is it that they are needing and how can we work to find a win-win solution here, and not just going out and saying, we have this financing available if you sign on to these targets. So really trying to find a balance between sort of a standardized solutions, but also being locally applicable.
Yeah. If I just, I think it's all really interesting, and what I find interesting from the financial sector perspective is that their scope 3, their scope 3 emissions are essentially a share of the companies that they invest in or finance. And so when you talk about your scope 3 emissions, that's already like a scope 3 of a scope 3. And so it gets even more complex. I think if I bring it back to that question of, how does ESG kind of intention, performance, progress, etc., help to secure finance? I think there's both a, what are you trying to achieve element of it, but increasingly I think there's a need and an ask on the how, which is like, lots of things that you've mentioned already in terms of what are the initiatives, like what is the investment required, what is the capex, how is it integrated into the company's governance, and also how you think about incentives, etc. And I think because it's still so work in progress in a way, like the more transparency around the how helps to inform kind of the confidence in whether the company will reach the goals. So I think that's, it's incredibly interesting, that dynamic between the different layers of scope 3 as well.
Yeah. And also, how do you work to standardize the accounting for reductions coming as well, which is a very tricky challenging, because obviously if you are one party making a big part of the investment, you will also like to see the return, even if that return is in terms of reduced emissions, which we are often measuring. Without the standardized accounting for how we're actually disclosing that, then, the incentive becomes not so viable and not so interesting for a lot of parties. So there's a lot of work needs to be done still on how to have a standardized area.
Yeah, I think that standardization is really important, and thinking about both the gaps, but also as Jenny was saying about that scope 3, you have that kind of derivative effect of uncertainties that themselves can multiply and gaps that, of course, can be quite significant. We have a little bit of time here for a few audience questions. So if you'd like to ask your questions, I think we'll have a microphone, and then I'll just quickly repeat the question just for everyone's benefit in the recording.
Yeah, hello. I'm Tanya Larson. I am British Ukrainian, and I have 20 years in tech, specifically B2B2C. So we run the all-through platform. And at the moment, I run very first sustainable voucher codes website. And my question is, understanding the issue of financing and everything else, because I have finance degree as well. Why nobody is thinking about communicating all of this knowledge to the downstream consumers, because they are the ones who are coming to H&M and buying your garments. And I'm asked the questions because I work with Exeter University Business School, actually. We run Sustainability Weekend there, and I had the question from students. They came, how do we know how sustainable the jacket from H&M is? And they're the people who bring you the revenue. So should it be looked downstream as well as upstream? And for example, how the student make a decision to buy from McDonald's rather than KFC?
So that question of looking downstream to consumers, and I'd be really interested, I think, there are perspectives all across this panel on both that consumer communication, but also how you're seeing the financial connection between what consumer demand is and some of these goals and measures we've just been talking about.
I can answer, and you can share from H&M perspective. We just had a whole discussion about consumer engagement on a different panel earlier, and I think when it comes from a McDonald's perspective, as a food company, many consumers in the general public, which tend to be a good proxy for our customer base, don't know where their food comes from broadly, and don't know to think through where some of the biggest impacts and footprint drivers are behind that food. When we've done consumer research on environment themes in the past, for example, the things that rise to the top for customers is really related to packaging and reducing waste, because that's the tangible part of an environment experience for them that they touch and feel as part of their meal. When we look at the data says the environmental footprint is actually quite much larger in the actual agriculture and food production. But again, if a customer doesn't know how food is grown and made and why that's impactful, or why that's done in a sort of sustainable and regenerative way, you have to kind of meet them where they are. So some of our colleagues who are on our UK team are here in the audience, and they've done some really brilliant marketing over the years to consumer populations of really emphasizing stories about our farmers and the producers, of starting with that real basics of this is real food, here's where it comes from, here's who it comes from. And that then understanding invites more inquiry and discussion around what are the practices behind that food and the who and how behind the food. So there is that sort of meeting customers and consumers where they are. And quite frankly, we still have quite a lot of awareness raising to do as a global society about these impacts. Luckily, younger generations are really excited and interested in this, so that awareness and interest is rising.
Yeah, no, I think, from our perspective, transparency has been a core value for us for a long time, and we try to communicate as much as possible. I think that we have a challenge in both areas, both in terms of, as you said, the understanding. These are quite complex topics. We have for a long time, for instance, communicated what type of fiber are we using. Is it a recycled or organic fiber? But we are now starting to realize, just as you, that it's not the biggest impact. But then trying to talk to a customer about what is the difference between a coal boiler and a biomass boiler, it's very difficult. It's difficult for us to try to understand it ourselves. But of course, we cannot, our approach was we cannot let perfect stand in the way of good and trying to do something. So there was a work trying to find a sort of nutrition care label for fashion. And we did a pilot together with SAC, so the Sustainability Apparel Coalition, on trying to put more impact on products. But what happened at that point was that, we tried to put as much as we could, but that could not be verified all the way in terms of an LCA. And instead, we run into regulatory problems in terms of what type of marketing can you actually do. So it needs to be a discussion also between, governments and in terms of marketing and greenwashing. How can we communicate what we know, even though we don't know all of it, and also trying to find the right level of the language so it is understandable. And that's a huge challenge, because if the customers and the consumers are not with us on this journey, it will be very difficult for us to do it alone. So it is a vital part, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Other quick perspectives on consumers, or shall we go to the audience? Other question here.
Aladdin Ben Ali, Kirkland & Ellis. I'm a lawyer in the sustainability team. I just wanted to ask what your view is on how much of your core sustainability strategy has been influenced by the raft of sustainability legislation that's come through and is going to come through in the next few years, whether it's sort of CSRD, whether it's CSDDD. How does that affect the core of your strategy?
Maybe Jenny, Sim, and Charles kind of speaking across a number of industries and providers, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, happy to start. Obviously, regulation is a big driver. We're seeing companies having to set very quickly plans, and these plans obviously include a very clear tech blueprint. So when we think about an ESG strategy, obviously the consultancies, the big four, everyone is super busy with accompanying decision makers today, the executive committees, CSOs, in terms of driving that strategy. A lot of it is linked to recent regulation. So I think there is a combination of regulation, but also investors' appetite in, I would say, integrating ESG metrics in how decisions are made in terms of investments. But I'd love to hear Jenny and Hampus on this. But fundamentally, I think it's a combination of regulation, investors, but also stakeholder management, whereby, be it from the consumer into the employees, into the rest of the stakeholders, asking for this type of information.
I think what has also been really interesting is the regulatory agenda helps to mainstream some of these issues and these topics and these themes as well. So, and it also kind of creates scale there. So In one sense, a lot of the regulation has been quite disclosure-driven, using disclosures as a very key mechanism to drive progress. On the one hand, it's very positive in terms of providing that transparency, encourages scrutiny, and that can also encourage action. But on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily quite it doesn't speak to ambition necessarily. There are other forces that need to come into play to really kind of drive a level of ambition. What I found very interesting is that there's also a good amount of peer pressure that then comes into this, and it speaks to the question on consumers as well. If I think about some of the net zero commitments, they're actually voluntary, but we have seen them come through. And so there is a big regulatory agenda there, but there's also, I think there are other forces that then come into play, but the regulation certainly I've seen has driven a lot of activity. Also, if I think about the financial sector, a lot of the kind of increased activity from the financial sector, and surprisingly, has been regulatory driven, particularly from the risk side, when financial regulators started requiring their supervised entities to respond to the risks of climate change. So I think that has been very positive in terms of getting more focus on the topic and starting to mainstream it.
Yeah, I mean, let me answer this in two ways, I would say. I mean, first, in terms of regulatory, what's happening on our selling markets, and especially in the EU. What we're seeing in there is that sustainability commitments and ambitions that might have been sort of more marketing or ambition-driven is now becoming sort of the regulatory norm. So we're increasing the playing field and leveling the playing field, which in one way is good because it drives a lot more. It's a lot of workload for us trying to keep up with everything what's happening, especially when there is, in some ways, conflicting or slightly different legislation in different markets targeting the same thing. So I think there needs to be a level of sort of another round of harmonization on all of that. The other area of that, though, is that we see a lot of legislation coming in our selling markets, while we might actually want to drive legislation in our production markets. Because what we're seeing in a lot of our markets, legislation is actually standing in the way of us driving some of sort of the decarbonization initiatives we want to drive. So could be, fossil fuel subsidies, or could be different rules and regulations on infrastructure or different technologies we would like to employ. So I think we're also working actively on sort of the public affairs on both fronts of how to manage what's happening in selling markets, but actually trying to drive more what's happening in the production markets, which is a quite interesting perspective. I don't know if it's the same for you as well.
I would agree that the leveling the playing field piece is relevant when it comes to the regulation question. I think when we look at transparency-related regulations, the pace and breadth of them coming at different sectors is not necessarily matched yet with the data systems and fluidity of information sharing for the providers that are going to be expected to. So I think there's a certain readiness question that if companies aren't asking yourselves, are you ready for CSRD? Do you know what that means? Some don't, and they're going to have to learn really fast, right? And so that sort of pace of the implementation of heightened transparency requirements is something that all companies with complex supply chains and business models are going to be having to grapple with. I do think there's also sometimes some trade-offs that get made in terms of the impact agendas behind some of the regulation, and you do see trade-offs at times. An example would be, conversations around reducing emissions. Everything and why that's important is pretty clear. We also see regulation coming around packaging and waste, and as a food service business with a largely fiber-based packaging portfolio, for example, a law related to reusable packaging might force us to go back to plastic and to increase our water and energy loads for the use and reuse of a now plastic cup instead of a fiber-based cup, which we source from certified sustainable forests and can be recycled. And so there's some unintended consequences where sometimes a combination of impacts from one regulation then gets in the way of our emissions reduction agenda. And you have to be looking at the interdependencies of some of these impact agendas, and are the regulations moving us all in the same direction, which is a complicated landscape to navigate, to say the least.
Yeah, and to kind of carry it back to the ESG performance and how that drives finance, also on the regional and country policy related side that Hampus had brought up. I think we were having a conversation earlier today about the deployment of finance into these countries where economic development, livelihood, for these countries is going to depend a lot on their ability to adopt and rapidly meet the needs of industry trying to produce in those countries and meet science-based targets. And so, the handwriting is on the wall that there's going to be movement of the supply chain out of certain countries if they're not able to accelerate, whether it's a JET-P country that's already taken on that type of transition plan or those that are rapidly following behind. And so the movement of capital into those countries is going to happen so much faster if we can also kind of create, whether it's policy or whether it's just government agreement as to investing, which is also a strong role of the development banks. And so a big part of helping them to work with us to incentivize the flow of that finance into those countries.
Great. So I think that is all the time we have, but a huge thank you to our panelists for their perspectives. And this is going to be a big topic that we'll continue to explore as metrics, data, and pressures from both suppliers, consumers, and supervisors only grow in the coming months.
Thank you.